In this next video, we're going to look more carefully at the anatomy of the difference between these two branches of the autonomic nervous system. So just a quick reminder, the autonomic nervous system is the involuntary control of things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. For all of these, we're going to find that there are autonomic ganglia, but there's going to be differences between what's called the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. So first, what we're going to look at is the anatomy of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And so for this division, the first thing that you will notice is that the preganglionic neuron cell body, so the first neuron cell body, the preganglionic neurons are the one whose cell body is in the spinal cord. And for the sympathetic division, all of these preganglionic neurons are in the lateral horn, so we kind of saw that in the last video, but of regions of the spinal cord from T1 through L2. So all of these center parts of the spinal cord, T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, T6, T7, T8, T9, T10, 11, 12, L1, and then L2. So they're all right smack in the middle. That's where all of the preganglionic neurons are, in that lateral horn. The axons then exit via the ventral root, so that's as we expected, but then the axons project to what's called the sympathetic chain ganglia. And so these are a chain of ganglia that are actually not too far away from the spinal cord. So they're just outside the spinal cord, the sympathetic chain ganglia, which a little bit, I think that sounds like a really cool band name. But whenever I think of the sympathetic chain ganglia, it helps me remember that these sympathetic neurons are all kind of in the middle of the spinal cord. So the sympathetic chain ganglia kind of help me just remember, oh yeah, the sympathetic division is all that mid region of the spinal cord that we're seeing here. So the sympathetic chain ganglia are this line of ganglia where the postganglionic neuron is found. This is the neuron that I think should just be called the ganglionic neuron because its cell body is, in this case, in the sympathetic chain ganglia. And then from the sympathetic chain ganglia, which is generically could just be called the autonomic ganglia, the axons then go a long distance to get to their effector organs, which are going to be various targets such as the eye to change the pupil dilation, and the salivary glands, or the bronchi of the lungs, or tissues of the heart, liver, the intestines and the digestive organs, the adrenal gland, and the bladder. So for the sympathetic division, what we kind of see first, when you imagine it, when you kind of picture it in your head, remember we're kind of in the middle regions of the spinal cord for the first neuron, and then the first neuron's axon is very short. Then you get to the postganglionic neuron, the second one, which is in these chain ganglia, the sympathetic chain ganglia, and their axon is going to be relatively long as it's extending to these targets. So kind of keep this anatomy in mind as we then look at the anatomy of the parasympathetic nervous system, which a little bit feels kind of opposite to me. So the first thing you'll note about the parasympathetic nervous system's anatomy is the location of the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons. These cell bodies are either located up way high or way low in the spinal cord. When I say way high, technically these cell bodies are within the brainstem. So they're not even in the spinal cord. They're technically in the brainstem, within nuclei of the cranial nerves. So these cell bodies are actually found in various nuclei of the brainstem. And then their axons exit. You'll actually recognize some of these axons. They're part of the cranial nerves because they're coming from these areas of the brainstem. So the third, the fourth, the ninth, and the 10th. I'm sorry, this is the 7th. I said the wrong thing. The 3rd, the 7th, the 9th, and the 10th cranial nerve. Or they're way down low, coming from S2 through S4. And so that's within gray matter regions of the spinal cord. And then these axons would still exit via the ventral roots and then join parts of the spinal nerves. These preganglionic axons are then very long. So the cell bodies were inside the spinal cord of the brainstem, and then the axons exit, and they extend quite a long ways until they get to, they're going to get to autonomic ganglia. But this time the autonomic ganglia are technically called terminal ganglia. And they're called terminal ganglia. That helps me remember that they're near the effector organs. So the first axon coming from the preganglionic neuron needs to be really long to get all the way to the autonomic ganglia, which is in kind of a terminal position, really close to the effector organ. But that's where the autonomic ganglia will be found. So it's called the terminal ganglia because it's really close to the target. And then they'll have a very short axon. The autonomic ganglia, or the postganglionic neurons axon will be very short because it has a very short distance to get to its target tissue. So what we could say is for the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons will either be very high or very low, and then the preganglionic neurons axon is going to be very long, and then you'll get to a terminal ganglia, the autonomic ganglia, whose axon will then be very short. So a little bit, this looks the opposite as what we saw with the sympathetic nervous system. But then as you look carefully at this picture, you can also see that most of the target organs are going to be basically the same. So we're going to places like the pupil and the salivary glands, and to the bronchi of the lungs and the cardiac tissue and the liver and parts of the digestive organs and the bladder. And so we're going to be stimulating some of the same organs, but this is via different nerves, and it's actually going to end up giving us different and opposite responses. Okay, so this is the first part of the anatomy. The second part of the anatomy to deal with is a difference in the types of neurons, and specifically when I say types of neurons, I'm referring to the type of neurotransmitter that the neurons release. So there can be different types of neurons because different types of neurons will release different types of neurotransmitters. And so we're going to name these neurons things like a cholinergic neuron. What a cholinergic neuron means is it's a neuron that releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter. And then there's a different type of neuron called an adrenergic neuron. And an adrenergic neuron is a little bit different because an adrenergic neuron is going to release adrenaline, which is also called norepinephrine. This is actually the more correct term, but I said adrenaline because it helps you remember that it's an adrenergic neuron. So it's related to adrenaline, but that name that we're going to use is going to be norepinephrine. Okay, so these neurons are going to be different in the types of neurotransmitters that they released. However, it's going to be predictable. So we're going to go through this information. First, let me reorient you to what we've talked about already. Here's the sympathetic nervous system. It's got its preganglionic neuron with a short axon, and then the postganglionic neuron has a long axon. And then here's the parasympathetic. Its preganglionic neuron has a long axon, and the postganglionic neuron has a short axon. So that kind of orients you to what you're seeing here. What we're about to add is the types of neurotransmitters released by each of these neurons. And we can keep this fairly simple by remembering that all the preganglionic neurons, parasympathetic and sympathetic, all the preganglionic neurons are going to be considered cholinergic neurons. That just means they're all going to release acetylcholine. So coming from this first neuron of the parasympathetic, it's going to release acetylcholine. And coming from this first neuron of the sympathetic, it's going to release acetylcholine. Okay, so that much is going to be the same and relatively simple. The postganglionic neurons then are going to be different. So the postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division will still be cholinergic neurons and secrete acetylcholine. Cool. So here's that parasympathetic division, here's its postganglionic neuron, and there it is releasing acetylcholine. And so really, so far what we've talked about is everything is releasing acetylcholine. And so we're just going to have one exception, and that's going to be from the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division. These neurons are, of all that we've talked about, they're the only ones that are different, and they're going to be adrenergic, which means that they're going to be the ones that release norepinephrine. So here, this is going to be the only spot where we see norepinephrine is released. And a little bit, I kind of remember that easily because the sympathetic division is the one that's going to kind of get your heart rate up, right? So that makes you think of adrenaline. And that's going to be mediating that fight-flight response. So to me, it makes sense that the one place that we're going to see something similar to adrenaline is going to be from these sympathetic neurons, specifically the ones acting on those target tissues. Now, if you're looking carefully, you're kind of looking down here and you're saying, wait, there's a little exception here. There is a little exception. It really just affects the sweat glands. And so we'll kind of see that as we go on through. But I try not to focus a lot on this. This is a little kind of like, oh yeah, there's that exception, a little aside. And instead, I try to keep the story focused on kind of this main pattern here, as far as most of the sympathetic targets will be receiving norepinephrine as their neurotransmitter. So next, I'd like to kind of compare things to what we've learned about the motor systems in general. And so here we're going to kind of look at the autonomic motor in comparison to the somatic motor. And so this is kind of a big summary picture that summarizes some of the things that you should be familiar with. And so first, thinking about the somatic division of the motor nervous system, this is the division that acts on your skeletal muscles and gives us that voluntary control of skeletal muscles. Remember, their cell bodies were inside the spinal cord in the ventral horns, and then they have axons that exit via the ventral roots and go to their targets. Notably, all of the somatic motor neurons will always be releasing acetylcholine. So when we think about neurotransmitters, acetylcholine is really getting used a lot, and we're really just going to have this one exception with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, and then in this next part, we're going to be able to look at the autonomic division, kind of in comparison to the somatic. And so for looking just first at the sympathetic components, their cell bodies are still in the spinal cord, just kind of in a different spot in those lateral horns. And then they have axons that exit via the ventral roots. For the sympathetic division, remember they use the sympathetic chain ganglia. So their autonomic ganglia are part of the sympathetic chain ganglia. And that word just helps me remember that these ganglia are located just outside the spinal cord as this chain of ganglia. And so that first neuron, the preganglionic neuron, is always going to be releasing acetylcholine and stimulating the second postganglionic neuron, who will then release neurotransmitters to the target organs, but the sympathetic nervous system is the one place where we release something different than acetylcholine, and that is norepinephrine. Also in this picture, you're seeing that one of the targets is going to be the adrenal medulla, and you can kind of remember the adrenal medulla when we talked about the endocrine system. The adrenal medulla is the middle part of the adrenal gland, and it releases hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, directly into the bloodstream. And then these hormones will actually go off and do a lot of similar things. But this just shows you that innervation to that adrenal medulla. Okay, and then the parasympathetic division, it's going to still have its preganglionic neuron cell body in the spinal cord. Its axon still exits via the ventral root, so that's the same for all of these guys. The cell bodies might be positioned a little differently, but that axon will still exit via the ventral root. And then for the parasympathetic division, this axon is going to be really long because it's going to go to the postganglionic neuron cell body is going to be in what are also called the terminal ganglia. And that word just helps me remember that, oh yeah, this is right by our termination point or our effector organ. And so then it's going to just have a very short little axon. And it's also going to be releasing acetylcholine. Okay, and then both of these guys are going to be targeting the same places. So smooth muscles in the internal organs, or cardiac muscles, or glands such as the salivary glands. The next thing we're going to talk about is the effect. Because even though we're releasing the same neurotransmitters, or in a lot of cases the same neurotransmitters, that doesn't necessarily mean that the effector organs are always going to be either excited or inhibited. For the somatic division of the motor nervous system, acetylcholine is always necessarily stimulatory. So this is nice and simple. If you release acetylcholine to a skeletal muscle, the skeletal muscle will contract. And this is going to be a story that we continue following into the next unit when we really get into muscles and how muscular contraction happens. That'll be our whole next unit. So we'll come back to this and we'll talk more about what acetylcholine is doing to these skeletal muscles. But it's always going to be stimulatory. So that's just a general rule that we can just kind of bank on. For the for the autonomic nervous system, it's going to depend on the receptors that are actually found in the effector organs. So this can be variable, and that's what we're going to look at next. So for both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, it's going to depend on the target cell's receptors, whether the neurotransmitter, either acetylcholine or epinephrine, is excitatory or inhibitory. So this can be variable. Let's try to follow this part of the story. First, thinking about acetylcholine is always going to act on cholinergic receptors. So that's the general term for the type of receptor that would bind acetylcholine. And that's nice because cholinergic and acetylcholine both have that choline word in there, so you can follow that acetylcholine will always bind to a cholinergic receptor. Now, the complicated part about this, then, is that there are two types of cholinergic receptors. There is a nicotinic cholinergic receptor, and there is a muscarinic cholinergic receptor. Nicotinic cholinergic receptors are always going to be excitatory. So guess what? The reason back here that we were able to say skeletal muscle is always going to be stimulatory is because skeletal muscle always has nicotinic receptors. So anytime acetylcholine hits a nicotinic receptor, it's going to be excitatory. So that I love that. That's a very easy story. And the reason for this is a nicotinic receptor is effectively going to be opening a sodium channel. So when acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic receptor, it opens a sodium channel, sodium rushes in, the cell depolarizes, or the cell at least has a graded potential. And so we can say that that it's always excitatory because we're opening a sodium channel. And so this is why for skeletal muscles, because they have the nicotinic receptors, they're always going to be excited anytime acetylcholine is acting on those nicotinic receptors. The other place that we have nicotinic receptors is all the autonomic ganglia. So if we go back to this picture here that shows the axons for the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So here, this is the cell body and the spinal cord, and there's that first axon. Remember, for the sympathetic nervous system, it's a short first axon because we're just going to the sympathetic chain ganglia. The preganglionic neuron always releases acetylcholine, and then the postganglionic neuron is always going to have nicotinic receptors. So this autonomic ganglia is always going to be excited. And that's going to be the same down here for the parasympathetic nervous system. So remember, its cell body was in the spinal cord as well, and then or the brainstem, and then it has a long axon that goes all the way out to the autonomic ganglia, which is called the terminal ganglia. Still releases acetylcholine, and then these will also, the postganglionic neurons, which are in terminal ganglia, will also have nicotinic receptors. So these guys will always be excited. And that works out, basically what that's saying is if the preganglionic neuron fires, the postganglionic neuron fires. If the preganglionic neuron fires, the postganglionic neuron fires. Or really, I guess if we were to be a little bit more nuanced, it always has an excitatory graded potential. It may be having other neurons acting on it, and so possibly there could be some summation that might affect whether those graded potentials actually give you an action potential. But in general, they're always going to be excited, we could say. And so typically, if the first one fires, the postganglionic neuron will do the same. Okay. So that's where the nicotinic receptors are, and they're always going to be excitatory. So really, as part of the story, we kind of only have to think about what's happening when the postganglionic neuron releases its neurotransmitter. And so here, remember that neurotransmitter is going to be different whether you're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, which releases the adrenaline-like compound, the norepinephrine. I believe here they've written it NA to stand for noradrenaline. And yeah, that's what they have written here. And then the parasympathetic will release acetylcholine. But what's going to be different here, both the target or all the target glands are going to have different types of receptors that we haven't talked about yet. So first, let's look at the parasympathetic division, because it's going to have what are called the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. And so that's written here. A muscarinic receptor is still going to be a cholinergic receptor, which means it's still going to be binding acetylcholine. And that works out because acetylcholine is what the postganglionic neurons are releasing. So the acetylcholine is going to act on a muscarinic receptor. But muscarinic receptors are more complicated. They are G proteins, which means they may be coupled to different types of channels. And then they may, because of that, be either excitatory or inhibitory. So this could be causing different effects on the target depending on that specific target. For the sympathetic nervous system, the targets are going to be the only ones receiving norepinephrine. So their targets are going to be the only ones that are going to be able to bind things like norepinephrine or what's written here is noradrenaline. These will also be G protein coupled receptors, which means they also may be excitatory or inhibitory. So it just depends on what is supposed to happen with those target glands, whether the noradrenaline or the acetylcholine actually makes the targets be excited or inhibited, and thus gives you that target response. And if we remember kind of what those target responses were, they're going to be opposite for the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic division. And we talked about this on the previous slide or the previous video, as far as how the rest and digest parasympathetic does things like contracts the pupil. The sympathetic does the opposite, which is dilate the pupil. And this is going to be mediated by different neurotransmitters. So the parasympathetic nervous system is releasing acetylcholine that's going to be acting on a muscarinic receptor. And so this is probably going to actually be excitatory since we're causing those muscles to contract. Over here on the other side, the sympathetic nervous system is releasing norepinephrine onto the target tissue, which has an adrenergic receptor. But in this case, for the pupil, the adrenergic receptor is probably being inhibitory because it allows these smooth muscles to dilate and allows the pupil the smooth muscles to relax, which allows the pupil to dilate. And so the neurotransmitter released is going to be different, but it doesn't necessarily tell us that all of these are going to be doing things like constricting. They could kind of go either way as far as being excitatory or inhibitory, and excitatory and inhibitory. So really what you have to think about is, okay, so what should the rest and digest nervous system be doing to each of these organs? And what should the sympathetic nervous system be doing to each of these organs? But as far as the type of neurotransmitter that's acting on them, this becomes really relevant when you think about drugs. Because if you think about, for example, the muscarinic receptors, these guys were named because they also respond, or they're named because they do respond to a drug called muscarine. And muscarine will do things, so if you ingest muscarine, it'll cause you to have all of these parasympathetic responses because the drug would act on the same receptors that the parasympathetic nervous system is doing. So you can imagine the drug muscarine kind of makes you rest and digest. And so in general, when we think about drugs and drug side effects, a lot of those types of side effects that you're seeing are going to be because they're modulating either all of the parasympathetic activity or all of the sympathetic activity, causing things like some drugs cause effects on your heart rate and your digestion. And if you look at some of those patterns in side effects, you'll see that they're typically modulating either sympathetic reactions or parasympathetic reactions in the body in general. Okay, the very last thing I want to at least mention, though I'm not going to give it its own video, I just want to kind of drop this so that it's something that you're aware of. We could talk about a third division of the autonomic nervous system, which is generically called the enteric nervous system. This nervous system is kind of another branch of that automatically controlled nervous system. But this is going to be specifically all of the neurons that control the gut. And so the thing about the enteric nervous system is this is essentially you could almost think of it as a second brain in the gut. These will be largely within the walls of the gut and will both receive sensory input from the gut, then have interneurons, and then give motor output right back to the gut. So all of the enteric nervous system is actually within the gut. As far as if you cut innervation to the gut, your gut would possibly be able to behave completely on its own by receiving sensory input saying, oh, there's something inside the stomach, to which the stomach would then contract and maybe push things along. So the enteric nervous system controls your digestive system, could be completely on its own. Now, the caveat to that is, even though it's capable of monitoring and controlling the digestive tract independently, there is definitely input to it. And we saw that even in the previous slides when we were looking at the parasympathetic nervous system can act on the enteric nervous system to increase its activity. And then the sympathetic nervous system can act on the enteric nervous system to decrease its activity. So yes, there is central nervous system and peripheral nervous system input to the enteric nervous system. But there is also an enteric nervous system which could be capable of having all that it needs to act independently. So a little bit, we do hit on the enteric nervous system a wee bit more when we talk about the digestive system in ANP2. But for the context of the nervous system lectures, this is as much detail as we're going to be able to go into. Really just an awareness that it does exist and it is modulated by the PNS or the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. But it is capable of controlling your digestion somewhat completely on its own. To give a password for this week's practice quiz and mini tests, which actually this week it is a unit test as we are completing the study of the nervous system, the password for this week's quiz will be ACH, which is an abbreviation for acetylcholine. I don't think acetylcholine would fit as a password, so we're just going to use the letters ACH, and I'll probably type those in all lowercase. I'm not sure if it's case sensitive, but do it lowercase. ACH is the password for this week's quizzes.